Hey, thank you so much for watching, listening today. Totally happy to spend some time with you. And we're starting a new series called Sheep, Shepherds, and Shams. You're like, what? Sheep, shepherds, and shams. Like, I don't know about you, but you might think of sham as like a pillow sham. However, in this situation, the sham is an imposture, like a poser, right? I just wanted to have the SH commonality, sheep, shepherd, shams. So that's why we picked that. But we're looking at John chapter 10 for this series. And it's a fairly familiar chapter, at least this little section, talking about Jesus is our shepherd, we are his sheep, the voice of a stranger we don't follow. And some of us have had, Sunday school stories, we heard about this. You might have read it, maybe occasionally if you read through John. Maybe this is brand new to you, but it kind of is really very, very interesting to think about what Jesus is saying in John chapter 10, verses 1 through about 21. And I want us to look at it, but I also want us to appreciate a little bit of some background on then the context for these verses. Because when the Bible was written, the Bible was not written like by chapter and verse. The Bible was written like John, who wrote the book of John, the gospel, he wrote it continuous. So there wasn't like these breaks that we read, John chapter 10, verse 2, they imposed those later to make it easier to find places and parts and pieces. But it's it's kind of an overlay, synthetic overlay, but it wasn't in the original. So when you look at John chapter 10, it's important that you consider looking at the preceding verses, and all the more because this is a continuous thought. This is a continuous, and actually, this is a fascinating thing to consider. This is a conversation between Jesus and religious leaders, the Pharisees at this time. So it's a conversation, and I think it's a really interesting conversation for us to think about. And I take it personally because I would consider myself, so to speak, a religious leader. I grew up in the church, and maybe you're not a leader, maybe you're not like a pastor, elder, deacon, usher, or whatever, small group leader. But for those of us who have religious upbringing or background, I think this is a really interesting conversation for us to think about. And you might have been around some, quote, religious people, and you might have been attracted or maybe repelled by them. But Jesus has conversations, and I always thought these conversations between Jesus and these religious leaders, I think about Nicodemus in John chapter 3, that was a very extensive conversation. And then a lot of the other conversations Jesus had with these religious leaders tends to be really hostile and combative. But this one is interesting because it's not, I wouldn't necessarily say it's hostile and combative, but it's very curious. It's very curious. And so when we think about that context, here's what happens in it. Jesus has healed a man who was born blind, and the man receives his sight. And this is at the beginning of John chapter 9. The man goes and washes, Jesus puts mud on his eyes. He goes and washes in the pool of Siloam. Jesus heals him. And because he gets healed, everybody around him is shocked. And I would just bring to your attention that sometimes when Jesus does amazing things for us, he heals our mind, heals our body, he restores our soul. If you go back to Psalm 23, which is a shepherd's psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And Jesus does those things for us. Not everybody gets excited around us when Jesus does amazing things for us or in us. And so the people around this former blind guy, they're like, it can't really be him. And so they take him to the religious leaders, the Pharisees in the temple, and the Pharisees in the temple, let's say, what happened? And then Jesus happened to heal on the Sabbath, which made all the religious leaders super cranky, like uber cranky, and so much so that they invited the man's parents to find out what happened. And the parents said, we know this is our son, we know he was born blind, but we don't know how he got healed, because the parents were afraid that the Jewish leaders would kick them out of the synagogue. So the parents leave, and then they keep questioning the man who was born blind, now healed. And so a lot of times when we have a religious upbringing and background, sometimes we don't understand how come this person got healed and that one didn't. Maybe we've been praying for God to answer something in our lives, give us a new job, direct our steps, and maybe we don't get what we pray for, but we see somebody else do, and it makes us jealous, angry, bitter, resentful. How come? And maybe that's some of these Pharisees, maybe, and then some of the religious leaders, maybe they were cranky because, we're deserving. We're like the elite. We're the righteous ones. We do everything but how come that guy who's a no name, like worthless, how come he gets it and we don't? And when they find out that Jesus was the one, it just starts to unravel, starts to spiral down. And so the religious leaders kick the guy out of the synagogue. And when they kick him out, Jesus finds him and has a conversation. Hey, do you believe in the Son of Man? Well, who is the Son? And so Jesus has a conversation with the healed guy. And then the Pharisees, and I think it's really important for you to think about this. The Pharisees ask Jesus, are we blind? And this is Jesus' reply. He says to the Pharisees, he says, if you were blind, you would not have sin. But since you say, we see, your sin remains. And what happens sometimes, if we have religious upbringing and background, we can get sometimes we can get kind of self-righteous. We can say, well, I'm better. I'm not like that person. I don't do that sin. I run my life more clean. I'm more upright. I'm more pious. And Jesus is kind of confronting that mindset and saying, wait a second, because you say you see, there's a whole lot of sin in you because ultimately you are deceived. You don't see well. And from that point, then Jesus starts to talk about being a shepherd. And he leads us into this very interesting conversation. And he says, truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter through the door into the fold of the sheep, but he climbs in another way, that man is a thief and a robber. And the translations is really interesting for you to think about. The thief and the robber. The thief is a Greek word, kleptomaniac. We know what that is, right? A person who can't help but steal. But interesting in the Greek, this word robber. So in English, those are synonyms, thief and robber. But in the Greek, this is the word, the robber word is actually more like bandit. It comes from the Greek word lesteo, and it means to act violently. If you remember the Good Samaritan, that parable Jesus talks about, the man on the road to Jericho who gets attacked and beat up by lesteo. That's the context. So it's not only somebody that steals, but this robber person, the bandit, is a person who steals plus is violent, hurtful, and destructive. And so Jesus says, anybody who doesn't come through me I am the door, he says it later, is a thief and a robber. And he's telling that to religious people. So I think it's really interesting because if we don't keep Jesus as central in our thoughts, central in the way we see things, central in how we come and go and how we conduct our lives. If Jesus doesn't stay central to our values, to our perspective, if he's not the lens, then we can kind of fall into some very easy traps and some deceptive areas that could be very hurtful and destructive to us. You're like, well, what does that mean? Well, that's a great question, because we're going to continue to answer that in the series and throughout this series and in the next episode of this series. So thank you for subscribing. Of course, you want to hit the notification bell right there. That'll help you know when we post new content. And here's a question for you to think about. Do you, and this is kind of a random question, and you're going to think it's a little weird. What's your favorite meat to eat? Like, well, I'm a vegetarian. Okay. So what's your favorite fake meat, if you want to call it? But do you like lamb? Do you like beef? Do you like fish? Do you like chicken? Do you like pork? What's your favorite meat to eat? And that just kind of goes with the whole sheep shepherd idea. And you're like, that's kind of cheesy. I agree. But, next time is going to get a whole lot better. And of course, we have this amazing joke that you want to really relish. So here's your joke. What did one nut say as he chased another nut? I'm a cashew. I know. Next week's going to be a lot better. Thanks again.